There is a chance to ask Harry questions at the end. We're going to have a panel session, but at the moment we're going to move on to our next speaker, who's Alyson Francis. And Alyson is the ACE Support Hub Director in Wales. And Alyson has been a great support to us in thinking about how do we take this whole issue forward in Scotland. A number of my colleagues in the ACE, who are part of the ACE Hubs, have met with Alyson on a number of occasions. She's been here before and visited with us. And so we're really grateful that she's come to speak to us. Alyson has for many years worked with the Welsh Government and is now seconded to develop that whole work to make, I love the way it's said, to make Wales an ACE-informed society and helping organisations to take an ACE-informed approach to their work, enabling systems to support early intervention and prevention and building resilience. So what a great aim for the work that you do. And Alyson's particularly going to talk about the work they do in Wales with the education sector. So thank you for coming to join us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. And don't be under the impression that this is all one way. It's not. It's fabulous having conversations with colleagues here in Scotland, because there is so much that we can share and learn from each other. And actually, I think working in that way will help us get much greater traction in really what's ultimately a shared ambition, I think, to make both of our countries best places to live for individuals. Earlier on, Linda mentioned the joys of speaking after Professor Sir Harry, and I have that joy. What you will also find is some of the material you see might be a little bit familiar. So here we go. So I thought I'd talk to you about a couple of things today. So I'll talk to you about some of the research that's happened in Wales, so the Wales ACE study. Some of that you'll have heard about just now, but it's really provided momentum and impetus for us across a whole range of organisations and sectors in Wales that's sort of driven a lot of the activity that I'll then go on to talk to you about. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Wales ACE Hub so you can think about what that might mean for you. And perhaps provide some ideas of some things that would be of interest. And I'll also go into a little bit more detail about what we've been doing in terms of adverse childhood experiences and trying to raise educational attainment, the approach that we've taken to that. If you'd like to see any of the Wales ACE studies, you can find them all online. If you go onto Public Health Wales website and just stick ACEs in the search engine, what you'll find are 4 reports on adverse childhood experiences in Wales, and also a very short animation which sort of sums up adverse childhood experiences in a nutshell. What's also interesting about, I think, about our study is that the very first report was published now 2 years ago. So the report that really sparked interest that I mentioned earlier has been around for a little while. What's also happening is that that interest has not waned. In fact, it's continued to gain momentum. And when I sort of sat back and I thought about, well, what actually has happened that where there's something that you've got teachers, you've got accountants, you've got police, you've got fire, you've got housing, you've got third sector talking about a subject, and 2 years later they are still talking about, but not just talking, doing something about that very same subject. And when, a bit like this event, you have an event that's advertised, it's booked out in sort of 24, 48 hours, you know, it's really unusual to find a topic that engages so many people in such a way that they can really see in that subject something that appeals to them and really touches the heart of what they do every day. And I think, you know, Sir Harry opened by saying this provides the context for the work that we're working in, the lives that we live. I really believe that partly sits behind what's driving what this can mean to us and the potential that's there to really make a difference. So we've run 4 ACE studies, as I mentioned. So the very first study looked at the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and health-harming behaviours. The second report then went on to look at the relationship with well-being. The third report looked at chronic disease and the impact on the health service. And then the recent report that was published just in January this year took a slightly different approach and started to look at what helps to build resilience, and particularly looking at it through the lens of mental health. What we also did in the report that was run just for January this year is run that very same survey, asking the question of those that were involved in the survey of how many ACEs have you had. Unsurprisingly and reassuringly, the numbers were broadly the same. What we also did in our last study is look at an additional 2 measures for the very first time. So we looked at emotional neglect and physical neglect. And the numbers that you see on the screen there are the numbers of people who have reported that they experienced those things growing up. And what we found that actually for those who had reported neglect, they also reported many other ACEs as well. So what we also know is that these things are really common. We touched on in the discussion earlier the fact that this isn't necessarily about groups of people over there, people that might be living in really deprived communities. Lots of people experience ACEs, and of course what we're really interested in is people that are experiencing multiple trauma, multiple adverse experiences as they're growing up. And again, numbers there, 14% of people living in Wales have experienced at least 4 more of those adverse childhood experiences that you saw on the previous slide as they were growing up. What we also know is that quite often they don't exist in isolation. If you have one, there's a very high likelihood that you'll have experienced many more. You'll have seen some of this a little bit earlier, so increased risk. So the Wales ACE study looked at, if you've had 4 or more ACEs, what might this mean? 6 times more likely to have unintended teenage pregnancy. The police in Wales are really interested in the adverse childhood experiences research and have started some programs of work, because for them, when they start to look at this, 4 times more likely to have been a victim of violence, 15 times more likely to have perpetrated violence. That intergenerational cycle, if you talk to them, they will know who they're going to be going out to calls with in the future. And also criminal justice, really interested in this, 20 times more likely for somebody to have been incarcerated at some point in their life. So they're starting to think about, okay, so how do we take a different approach to the work that we're doing? What can we do to break some of the intergenerational cycles that we start to see? How, when we go out to families where we are looking to arrest or be involved with the parents, do we start to look at what children are in the family and are present in those situations, and how can we make a difference to the experiences of those young people? Second report then looked at mental well-being. So looked at the fact that adults with 4 or more ACEs were much more likely to have low mental well-being. And when you start to look at what this might mean, you can think about, well, how does this impact on some of the services that we provide? So when you start to understand that if you've had multiple ACEs as you were growing up, you could be 4 times more likely to have never or really thought clearly, that you're 6 times more likely to have never felt optimistic, and 5 times more likely to not be able to make up your mind about things. What does that mean when you're presented with a whole range of options about what you do with the help that's provided? The most recent report then looks at increased risks around mental illness, and what you see here compared to people with no ACEs, those who have experienced 4 or more are probably not going to surprise you, 9.5 times more likely to have felt suicidal or have self-harmed, 6 times more likely to have received treatment for mental illness. So the numbers, as you start to look at the implications of what this research is saying, really start to add up. The report also looked at then, well, it's all right understanding maybe a bit more about the problem and what this means for us, but how do we know what might make a difference? And let's start to explore that. The report itself looked at measures of resilience in both childhood and adulthood. The childhood information is up here. So what we do know is that having somebody you can look up to, that trusted adult role in your life, has a really big impact in terms of helping provide a protective factor and build resilience for a young child. Somewhere where they can go have a conversation and feel safe doing so and sharing some of their experiences with somebody. But also what you start to see is that relationship with the social community aspect. And we sort of Professor Sir Harry touched on this earlier on a bit, the importance of social cohesion that was there in the past, which we seem to have designed out of a lot of our systems really through the changes in policy over time. And now when you start to look at what's in some of this report, you can see the mistakes of the past are starting to come to fruition. This is just one element of the report that looked at the trusted adult relationship and the relationship with current mental health illness. And what you'll see for those that had that trusted adult role in the past, a much lower a likelihood of experiencing current mental health. So a difference there for those that have experienced 4 or more ACEs by around 10%. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been running a little bit of a campaign asking people about who the trusted adult was in their life. And we've had a range of answers that have come back. Quite often parents, often people have named one or the other, mum or dad. Grandparents featured quite frequently, but also teachers and sporting coaches have been others that have come up on quite a regular basis. So when we talk about trusted adults and when we're thinking about the roles that each of us have in our lives, I think it's that question that we can ask ourselves of whose hero might you be and whose life might you be able to make that difference to. So what we know that there are 4 key areas really when we can start to think about building resilience and building protective factors. We know that one of the strongest is having that always available adult, that trusted adult that I mentioned just now. What we also know is that actually feeling culturally connected, having a sense of belonging can really help make a difference, as can feeling that you've got some control over your life, guiding your destiny, overcoming hardship. I was struck just now, and it's something we find ourselves saying quite often, is that understanding and bringing the data together is really important, but then asking that question about what is it that you need and not assuming that we have all the answers and we know what people need, I think is really important. So putting the decisions back in the hands of individuals who know themselves best. And then managing your behaviour and emotions, so understanding what's going on and being able to think about, well, what can make a difference. I was lucky enough last year to go on a bit of a study tour around the States and visited a couple of schools, and there was one in particular that always sort of sticks in my mind. We had the chance to talk to some of the young children that were there in the school. And what was clear is they'd been learning quite a lot about their brain and how their brain works and how that can affect their emotions. But also they'd been learning about how to recognize those emotions and then thinking about the sort of strategies that they might put in place to help manage their emotions. And each child had a little card at the top of the desk that they'd produced themselves, which sort of give them a bit of a reminder that when they were really angry, what really worked for them in trying to sort of work through their anger, or if they were feeling really anxious, what it was that worked for them. So really simple things sometimes can just make a whole world of difference. The report itself came up with a whole number of conclusions. One of the things that we did find in that last report, which was quite interesting, was the role that participating in sport can have. And we saw a strong correlation across mental health and reduction in mental health illness, feelings of suicide and self-harm, both in children and adults, where they participated in sport. What we also saw was a relationship with community culture, so where people were involved within their local community in events which were of a cultural nature. So that sense of belonging really holding true there, and being able to develop networks of support. What also was quite obvious from the report is that those who may benefit the most from some of the things that I've just talked about may be the least trusting, and also might be the least likely to be involved in some of those activities. So there's a question there about what do we do as society to be much more inclusive and enabling of people to participate in things that really might help make a difference. So that was sort of a bit of the backdrop of what's been happening, I suppose, from an evidence base in the country. And I mentioned earlier on that that evidence and the way it was presented in a nutshell really just spoke to people. In some ways, a lot of people that we talk to go, well, there's nothing new in this, we knew it already. But the bit that's different is the fact so many people are talking about it, and people that wouldn't necessarily go, oh, I knew this already. And so as a result, we thought, well, why don't we do something about this? So we have in Wales a group of public services and third sector organisations that have come together on a voluntary basis to look at reducing health inequalities. And they thought, well, one of the things we could be looking at is sort of responding to this momentum. So what are we going to do? Well, I know we'll set up a hub. So we've got lots of hubs in Wales. But actually, it's proved to be really useful in trying to provide a bit of a wraparound around what is, when you start to think about it, you know, massive. It's like this. And some nights I lie there thinking, oh my goodness, you know, we're trying to change the world, but you've got to start somewhere. Have big aspirations. So, Cymru Wales is the name of this voluntary collaboration, set us up with 5 different goals, and you'll see these are quite broad in themselves. So one of the things that we've been doing is spreading information and knowledge about adverse childhood experiences. And I think it's fair to say, since we set up about a year ago, we've spent most of our time working on that particular goal. And really in response to this continuing momentum, but also to give us a bit of breathing space while we try to work out, so, okay, what are we going to do next? Second goal then is around sharing evidence about what organisations can do. We haven't done quite so much of that yet. Public Health Wales over the last year has been undertaking a review of what works. That's going to be published very, very shortly. And off the back of that, we're going to start making a bit more of a difference with this goal. I think it's also fair to say, in this space, we're learning quite a lot. So we're building some of the evidence base as we're going along. And I think we're working with the principle of do no harm. Sometimes you just have to try stuff out and be innovative. And that is what's been happening. Our third goal then is around developing knowledge and skills amongst organisations and professionals. We've done quite a bit of work on that, which I'll touch on a little bit further along. Pulling learning from organisations, from individuals, and trying to share that. So the last year, we've seen some fabulous examples of where organisations, individuals have been taking what we call an ACE-informed approach to their work. I was really excited a month ago because after a year of trying, we finally managed to recruit our person that's leading on stakeholder stuff and comms. So we're now absolutely steaming full ahead with trying to think about how do we share what we've already seen that's going on out there. And if you want to follow some of that stuff, I can tell you how a bit later on. And then the biggie really is around how do we try and drive change at local and national levels. What we're starting to see as a result of spending this time of spreading the word is lots of bubbling up of community activists really that are starting to go, ooh, I can recognise some of this in my community and I want to do something about it. So we're starting to see pockets across the country really early forming where communities want to take responsibility themselves and start to think about how can we make a difference for the places that we live, particularly in areas where there is a little bit of community cohesion that still exists. The approach we're taking, this is sort of it in a nutshell. So we've been trying to think about how do you do the bigger strategic stuff? How do you think about, for some, shift in what is really a cultural approach within their organisations and a lot of organisational change? How do we support that by helping people understand, well, what does this stuff actually mean in practice? So when somebody talks about ACE informed, what does that look like? How does that feel? What are the principles that sit behind it? So we've been starting to do a bit of work around that. Tools and resources to try and support. Thinking particularly about, we've sort of moved away a bit from training now, and we're talking a bit more about learning. This isn't about you go on a training course, you become ACE informed, you suddenly know what to do. I think it's much richer than that when you start to think about it. And over the coming year, we're starting to move a lot more into how do you have this conversation with the general population and society. Some of it is already starting to happen, but as you get into it, you start to think about how can you talk about adverse childhood experiences in such a way that they are not stigmatising, they're not isolating, that they are very inclusive. And what we get a lot of feedback of is the word adversity in the title is really a bit of a turn-off. Quite a bit to think about there. So in relation to education, what we've seen is there are a couple of drivers that have suddenly come up, but we were already working on this stuff anyway. So recently published by the Welsh Government, Education Wales, our national mission, starts to talk about how we need an education workforce in Wales that is informed. So going back to this learning, understanding what this means for organisations. We've also got a whole curriculum reform, which has really got understanding of emotional well-being right at its core. So some of that will be built into the curriculum, but actually what we've seen is that schools want to start where they haven't already much, much earlier, and there is a massive appetite. For us, we're also really lucky that we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which drives organisations, public sector organisations across Wales to think about future generations. So some of the stuff we've heard about earlier, about how we're thinking long-term, how we're not just reacting to the immediate, and for local authority areas across the country having to identify and work with communities to come up with wellbeing objectives. 16 out of the 22 have all got objectives specifically around adverse childhood experiences. And others, even where they're not explicit, you can see it woven into what the objectives are. So for us, that piece of legislation is a massive driver to make change across the whole system. And of course, you know, for us, we've got children's rights enshrined in our legislation. But really, when you start to think about what is this really all about, it's about human relationships, it's about human rights, it's about children's rights. So actually, by working in a much more ACE-informed way, that's all we're doing is upholding those rights that already exist. So the right to relax, the right to have a good standard of living, the right to feel safe and be the best that you can be. Really, if we start to think about how do we change the way that we are, the way we work, how we can become much more ACE-informed, we start to really make great strides towards achieving these rights, I think. In relation to schools in particular, then, we've started to think about schools and education as a sector being one that's been really forward-looking and really having a voracious appetite in this space. So we've started working off the back of a project that was actually started by the police in an area in South Wales called Bridgend. They started developing some work and we've taken it and are looking to expand it. Something called a readiness tool, which starts to ask organisations questions about how they are, identifies the strengths they've already got that they can celebrate about working in an ACE-informed way, develops a whole load of learning for a whole school approach. So this isn't just about teachers, this is about the whole school and the communities in which they live. It tells them a lot more about adverse childhood experiences, but also some of the things that are useful, that helps them recognise some of the behaviours that they might be seeing, what sits or could be sitting underneath those behaviours, and what they might start to think about their approach being. Developing some resources to support learning. This one's coming up a bit more during this coming year. And then we've been developing, and we've kindly borrowed this from you. So within Scotland, you've developed the trauma framework. Lots of people loved that in Wales. So we went, okay, we might repurpose it and reuse it and share it. And we've been looking at how we make that in the language that we use. So we use much more ACE-informed language. And how do we try and align it with what's out there already, but really make real for people what is the knowledge and what are the skills that you might need if you're working in an ACE-informed way? Because quite often when we talk to groups, they start to think about what this might mean, it starts to sound really big, and they get really scared. And we get quite often that, I'm not a social worker, or I'm not a therapist. And we're saying, actually, you don't have to be. And that's that, of course, is your job. And it starts to make it feel a bit more real and a bit more tangible. What we've also found is that some of the schools in the areas that we've piloted have been very forward-looking in terms of nurturing. And they started out by saying, well, we do a lot of this stuff already. We think we're really good. Wellbeing is at the heart of what we do. We're really nurturing school. We really think about attachment. And only a few months after going through the pilot, we start to see them saying, I can't believe how much difference. Understanding more about ACEs and taking a bit more of an ACE approach to our work has been. So that's quite reassuring for us in that actually we could be starting to see a bit of a difference. So we're thinking about how do we create systems that understand what toxic stress is and the impact that that has on individuals, how that drives behaviours that you might see before you, and how that gives you a different lens to start thinking about the situations that you might be experiencing. Because what you often see, as you all know, happening on the surface isn't necessarily what's going on underneath. And just understanding that can really help take a different approach. I mentioned earlier on that the police were really interested in this. We've been, some colleagues have been doing some training with the police around understanding ACEs, understanding the impact on behaviour. And many of them are starting to say, actually, I realise it's not actually about me. It's about the person that I see in front of me, particularly vulnerable individuals. And it's given me a different way of understanding the behaviour that I might see. It's not necessarily that they want to really antagonise me or be really threatening. It's just an individual's way of coping in a situation that they find themselves. Long-term outcomes that we're looking to achieve, nothing on here that will be of a surprise, really. So sort of improved educational attainment, improved behaviour, fewer school exclusions. What we find quite often, and I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, a lot of our systems are built so you only get help when you reach crisis point. To me, that is just absolutely bonkers. And we've just seen that happen so many times. So part of the work is thinking about how do we change that, because that is just not a way to treat individuals. And of course, there's much more that we've been doing as well. We looked at and talked about housing a little bit earlier. My colleague Charlotte was here in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago talking about the work we've done in ACEs and housing, another sector that really sees the potential that they have to make a huge change to people's lives through the way that they work. My colleague Laura has just begun some work looking at how we create an ACE-informed youth workforce. Key role for the youth workforce, particularly when you start to think about that trusted adult role, that the role that youth workers can play, but not just youth workers. We're also working with the youth justice system here who've made some huge differences in relation to young offenders across the country. Public services boards I've mentioned, and we're trying to create this, and we're in the middle of doing it, this vision of what an ACE-informed Wales could look like. So if we start to think about what might these changes be, how do we bring that alive? So we shall have that available within the next couple of weeks, something very rich and pictorial, which helps people see where their work might fit into this agenda, because there's lots of people doing lots of stuff, and we want to make sure all that energy is all being pulled in the same direction to make a really big difference for people living in Wales. I touched on earlier on crisis, and this is just one example of that in the work we've done in housing. when we start to think about organisations and ACEs, we think particularly about relationships. How do we make sure we've got really proper human relationships? How do we make sure our working environments feel safe for people, not only for those that might be using our services or children that are coming to school, but also for the people that work there, because one of the really important elements in all this is the self-care of all individuals. And of course, we often hear the message of, you know, you can't help others until you've helped yourself. So that importance of thinking about workforce and the people that you work with. And then, of course, thinking about resilience and the assets that are already there, and the ability to start to think about how we can be a lot more creative in the work that we are doing. So much to say, really, and so little time. And I've sort of given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We talk very much, really, about ACEs not being another thing. So how we can try and work in a way where we use the evidence in a way which is quite sustainable, that is not put as another thing on the thing to-do list, because we all know there's another new shiny thing which comes behind the current shiny thing. So it's, for me, it feels like this is a real opportunity, and to miss this opportunity would be an absolute tragedy. So part of our work is thinking about how we ingrain this, how it provides the context, how it informs what and how we do. It's not about necessarily doing more. Sometimes it just might be about doing different, and sometimes you need to be brave, because this is a bit of a leap in some cases where we don't actually know that the thing we're going to do is really going to work, but we're going to try it with the best intentions at heart. And it's never too late. So although we've talked about children and the role of children being really important, it's never too late to break that intergenerational cycle. And we've been really clear about that when we've been talking to services across the country. Ooh. How that's sort of mutated itself from how it looked a few hours ago. But yeah, the evidence, you know, you've heard it said lots of times this morning, has huge implications when you start to think about what it can mean for our work, how it can really matter to individuals and their lives, and how you can make that trajectories that we saw earlier on move in a different direction. If you want to follow what we're up to, there are many ways, and I'd encourage you to do so. But you can find out a bit more about us here. So thank you very much for inviting me to come along this morning and listening to me talk about